Hello and welcome to Treasures from Heaven, an exploratory tour of Christian art and architecture. My name is Sharon Tay, and on behalf of the Asian patrons of the arts in the Vatican Museum, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all the patrons joining us as well as our guests. Thank you for being here today. This lecture series is underwritten and presented thanks to the generosity of the Asian patrons of the arts in the Vatican Museums. As a nonprofit organization, the patrons exist to preserve, protect, and restore the vast treasures that reside in the Vatican Museums. Today's lecture, The Dreaming Spires and Great Libraries of England, is the second in a four-part series where we will be visiting the treasures of Cambridge and Oxford. These two international centers of excellence are rich in history and beauty and boast an illustrious alumni, Adam Smith, John Wesley, and Bill Clinton, amongst others from Oxford, Oliver Cromwell, Charles Darwin, and David Attenborough from Cambridge. Oxford in the 11th century is the oldest university in the English-speaking world. Cambridge was founded by scholars from Oxford in the 13th century, and the two institutions have a long history of rivalry. In more recent times, Oxford has seen its fair share of tourists visiting Harry Potter sites, such as the Bodleian Library and Christ Church College. Personally, I'm glad for the opportunity to have visited friends studying in Cambridge in the late 80s, and more recently to Oxford with our twin daughters, who were then huge Harry Potter fans. It was my hope that they would come away from Oxford with more than Harry Potter impressions. We do hope you will enjoy today's live lecture, and if you'd like to rewatch any part or share the presentation with others, the series of these lectures will be posted online at the Asian Patrons website after each session. As we have more than 400 participants registered from all over the world, your sound and video has been switched off. If you have any questions, please type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. These will be collected and answered at the live Q&A session at the end of the talk. Our presenter today is Father Michael Collins. Father Michael Collins is a priest of the Archdiocese of Dublin and has taught history, art, and culture in a number of universities in Rome. A native of Ireland, Father Michael studied art and archaeology at the Pontifical Institute of Christian Archaeology in Rome. A best-selling author, Father Michael has written and edited 15 award-winning books. His most recent book, Raphael's World, was just published this year to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the death of the celebrated Renaissance artist. Father Michael has been featured on various international TV channels, including CNN, Fox News, NBCSN, Sky, as well as appearing on 60 Minutes. Please welcome Father Michael Collins.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon as we make our visit to Cambridge and to Oxford. Last week when we met, some people were saying that they wanted to go immediately to Paris and to Chartres to see those two wonderful cathedrals. Well, I think this afternoon, as we make our virtual visit to England and to see these wonderful cathedral towns and university centres, you'll be very interested in what we've got to see. It's absolutely a sadness, I think, at the moment with the plague throughout the world, which prevents us traveling. But at least at the moment in our mind's eye, we in the patrons are able to hover across the surface of the globe, swooping down from time to time to see some of the wonderful hidden treasures. And the names of Oxford and Cambridge universities are, I think, iconic. Everybody seems to know them in the world, no matter what your language. If you just say the word Oxford and the word Cambridge, people summon up in their mind's eye places which are of extraordinary beauty, but also of intense learning and research. And it's interesting to note that at present, the pandemic is being fought in Oxford, and we'll speak a little bit more about that at our questions and answers. So maybe we start at the very beginning. When did Oxford and Cambridge begin? Were they founded at the same time? Were they allies? Were they important places for learning from the very beginning? And I think you'll be surprised to note that Oxford was the first, it at least claims to be the first college of higher education. It was founded at the end of the 11th century, and no matter what book you read or who you talk to, there'll always be a little fuzziness around the foundation dates, but certainly at the end of the 1090s, Oxford had begun as a place for the training of Benedictine novice monks. So these were young monks who were training to be followers of the 5th century Saint Benedict of Nursia, an Italian monk who founded monasticism in the West. Now, monasticism, of course, had been born in Egypt in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, but Benedict set up these schools of prayer and of study and of manual work, which we call monasteries, or large ones were called abbeys. And these spread throughout Europe, and they became beacons of civilization even at the time when the Roman Empire collapsed after 476 in the West. And they were places where literature was preserved, where learning was promoted. And they became, probably in the 7th, 8th, and 9th, and even to the 10th and 11th century, the principal places of learning. So first and foremost, these were religious centers. They're important centers for learning literature as well. And then gradually they added other skills. So the University of Oxford had very humble beginnings. They say that probably there were no more than 10 to 15 young monks who came with a couple of masters in order to learn theology and what would have been called the liberal arts. And this was an area of philosophy, and it was an area of theology. And it was just to try and look and see what they could learn and what they could contribute, but it's very, very, very local. So we would say that the University of Oxford has its roots and beginnings over many, many parts of the area of Oxford, which would be the town. If we look at this aerial photograph, we see the center, and one of the things I'd point out to you is that it seems to be quite regular. Everything is laid out in squares. Well, this was a medieval town, so if we go back in our mind's eye 1,000 years, we would be on plains, we would be just looking at areas of fields, and there were probably, I think there was probably no more than 2,500 to 3,000 people at the turn of the 12th century. So the little colleges which we're used to, and now Oxford boasts 30 independent colleges and Cambridge has 31 independent colleges, these were all ranged around these squares. So the way they were built was there was a chapel for prayer, there was a hall for study, and then there was a dormitory where the monks and the masters slept. And they were very rudimentary. They were very, very, very simple buildings. And a refectory to one side looked after the kitchens and the dining. So they were quite self-contained. But over the years, as they became more and more popular, they were able to expand more. And an interesting point also is while they may have begun as Benedictine foundations, certainly by the 13th and 14th century, they were now being added to by Franciscans, by Dominicans, by Carmelites, by Augustinians, and a number of different religious orders, mainly mendicant friars. It was very important for them also to study theology because they were going out into the marketplace and they were teaching the people. And as we mentioned last week when we visited Paris and Chartres, we mentioned at the time that people were largely illiterate. The mass of people couldn't read nor write, so therefore they depended on a certain class. And the two classes which emerged were first and foremost in the religious area of the monasteries, and from them grew the law courts and the lawyers, the judiciaries, the attorneys, which we would have today. So as I say, as we look from this aerial view, we'll get an idea of what Oxford looks like today, but the large part of Oxford, in fact, expanded in the 19th century. That's when there was kind of an explosion. And we're going to find as we go along that if we were to stop in every single college on the road, we would be here till next week. And it wouldn't be possible. So what I've done is I've just chosen a few little places that we can swoop down from the air and have a look at. As I say, the early buildings were very, very ordinary, but they were just rudimentary and they were really quite frugal. But over the years also, they were lucky enough to have patrons who very often were either of royal extraction, that would be a king making a foundation, as in the case of both Oxford and later of Cambridge, but also past pupils who had made it in the world, let's say, had made some money. They wanted to share, and they became patrons of the universities, and very often they made endowments or they left land. A friend of mine who's a fundraiser at Oriel was telling me that I think in the 17th century they were left an orchard in London by a deceased member of the college. And of course, if you look at London today, what is on that orchard? A skyscraper. So you've got rents coming in, and that's why many of the colleges then were able to sell their orchards, their little pieces of farmland which were left to them, and then to build these wonderful edifices which we have principally between the 18th and the 19th centuries. Now, we're going to look for a moment at how the process of making the books that went into the libraries took place. So we're going to step back a little bit and we're going to go back into the Middle Ages. And have you ever wondered how a medieval manuscript is made? It's actually made from calf skin or from sheep skin. And again, if we could go back 800 years, we didn't have the, let's say, the disposability that we have today of just buying garments, throwing them out after a few weeks and virtually destroying this planet and causing global warming and climate change. People in those days, they were very close to the land. They used everything they had. So they had some domestic animals. These would produce milk, cheese, eggs, etc., butter. And then the animals, when the time came for them to be disposed of, even their carcass or their skins were used. The carcass very often was eaten as meat, but the skins themselves were taken off and they were cured and they were turned into a variety of purposes. Clothes was obviously the first and foremost. People would wear leather coats or fur jackets. But one of the kind of the side processes was to make what is called vellum. And vellum is a very, very thinly sliced sheet of a hide. So in this case, we're looking at a contemporary medieval account. It looks like a cartoon, but in fact, this dates from the 15th century. And we see the gentleman on our left-hand side. He is shaving the skin. So the skin has been soaked in lime and it's softened the hairs and it's also softened the fat. So what he does is here, he gets a blade and he runs the blade down across the board where the hide has been laid. And you see he's shaving off the hair. And he'll continue doing that until he's got the hide relatively soft. Then in the middle, we'll see another gentleman has taken the hide and he stretched it on a rack. And this is now going to become almost like a painting canvas. And he gets what looks like a hatchet or an axe, but in actual fact, it's simply a blade. And then he continues the work of cleaning and softening and taking the remaining hairs off the parchment. And then it's polished with pumice stone just before it's finished. It's stretched out for maybe a week or two to dry completely. And then it'll take its form. And bit by bit, the canvas will then be pumice dried and pumice cleaned so that it becomes almost like silk. And on our far right-hand side, we see some people continuing that work. Again, it's a contemporary drawing. And at that stage, the vellum was ready for use and they were going to be able to do something with it. I think we missed a slide there, perhaps. If we go back. There we go. Here we have the writing implement. And again, on our left-hand side, we see what the original pen was. And until, certainly when I was a young man, until the 21st century, we were still writing with the descendants of quills, pens, ink pens. So the original quill was made from the feather of a bird, usually a duck. And these were taken, they were cut with a penknife at a diagonal slant. And then in the middle of the cut, a blade was inserted once more so that there was a little opening in the quill. And therefore, all the monk had to do, if he was writing his text, was to dip the quill into the ink and then to write on the prepared parchment. Now, in those days, in order to see a straight line, they didn't draw lines like we would have in a copybook. They incised the lines. So they got a sharp stylus, a sharp knife, and they ran down diagonally across, perpendicularly and diagonally across the page. And then they scored straight lines all the way down so that to the naked eye, they're invisible, but to the scribe who's beginning his work, they were visible. So here we see him hard at work. And again, another contemporary painting. This is an illuminated manuscript, and it shows us the monk or the scribe at work. Now, when I mentioned monks, also, I mentioned a few moments ago also law, and law was a very, very important profession in the Middle Ages because people are always arguing. Lawyers, attorneys, they love when people argue because that's how they swoop in and make money. And I hope there's no lawyers or attorneys listening today, but it's a way of making money. So this was a profession, and the law and the church were very, very, very closely allied, as we'll see as we go through our visit today. But again, we've got our gentleman who is sitting happily in his scriptorium. He's got his books to copy. And remember, again, all of these were single handmade, once-off books. These were not printed because the printing press really didn't come in until the 1450s onwards with the invention of the movable typeface by Johannes Gutenberg in Germany. So the manuscripts which we're looking at the moment, and we can see them in the libraries in Oxford and Cambridge, and indeed in other collections throughout the world. And of course, in the Vatican Library, there's an enormous collection. These books were written and made very often as a copy of another book, but still they were one-offs. They weren't mass-produced. And I believe that the value of an illuminated manuscript, which very often contained a lot of gold leaf and valuable pigments, would be the cost of a car in today's world. So if you're spending X amount of currency for a car, one illuminated manuscript would have cost you the same amount. And at the end of the process, when the scribe went to write his manuscript, this is what he did. The vellum was always folded over in a scroll so that there were no creases. And that's a very important thing, because if you store the vellum already cut and creased, that reduces its usability. So this is what he was able to take off the shelf and to lay out and then cut into the square which he needed. Again, I love this little picture on the left-hand side, because this is the cellarer, the monk who is looking after the beer and the wine in the cellar. And St. Benedict actually devoted a chapter in his rule to the role of the cellarer, saying that the cellarer had to be an upright person, not given to drink, but he was the one who had to give the monks their wine at the appropriate time. But I think this particular cellar, who he's got the keys, and he's probably come down to the cellar just to help himself in the afternoon, and he's filling with one hand he's filling his flask, and with the other hand he's drinking. Anyway, I suppose that only happened in those days. It wouldn't happen now. I also wanted to show you on our right-hand side a book, and because we're a group of patrons who are dedicated to preserving the past, this is an example. I just came across this photograph and I thought it was interesting at the top. This is an example of a book in Oxford. It's a collection of the Pauline epistles, although it's a medieval manuscript. See how damaged it is. The covering has been damaged, the spine has been broken, and the pages are eventually going to fall out. And that's why all the libraries continue to look after their manuscripts, to look after look after them and preserve them and restore them. And again, underneath we have a page from that manuscript. It shows the holes which have been damaged. And even though this is a leather page, if you like, this is made of cowhide, of veal hide. Even if you look at this, it's hundreds of years old. When it was made, like in the previous slide, it was on beautiful white parchment. It's aged now, but these are extraordinarily important documents that we must preserve from one generation to the next. We're enormously grateful that we have inherited them, and we want to pass them on as best we can. One of the great libraries in Oxford is the Bodleian Library, and the Bodleian Library had its origins actually in a donation which was given by the brother of King Henry V, Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester, and we'll see that in a moment. But this is probably familiar to Harry Potter fans. This is one of the places which would be connected with some of the movies. But this is the Radcliffe courtyard, the Bodleian courtyard, I should say, which is part of a complex which was built at the end of the 16th century, when there already had been a reform within the Catholic Church, when Henry VIII had broken with Rome and had assumed authority for the church. But nevertheless, the university continued to be an important place for people to study theology and philosophy. So even though there was a sad and unfortunate break in the 1530s, 1540s with Rome, nevertheless, Oxford remained an important place. It became Anglican, it became Church of England, it became a university under the tutelage of the king, under royal protection, but nevertheless it became a very important centre for Anglicanism, for the Reformed faith. So I mentioned that the library was founded by Duke Humphrey. He was the younger brother of Henry V. He was the Duke of Gloucester. And at his death, he donated 281 manuscripts which he had collected during his life. So remember, if I say that every manuscript cost the price of a modern day car, well, you can get a pretty good idea of how vast this fortune was to be collected. So naturally, the authorities at the university, it was still a very small place. We're talking probably in the late 1470s, 1480s. It was still quite a rural town. Nevertheless, when they received this enormous bequest from the brother of the younger brother of the king, they then had to do something to build and to preserve that collection. So they wanted to build a library, and they decided to build over what was called the Divinity Hall. We've looked from the outside in our previous image. We looked at the Bodleian courtyard, and now we can see inside. And you'll be curious also, two things maybe. If we look at the bookshelves, first of all, this is on the first floor. So this is above you have to go up a set of stairs. So this is above the actual ground level. And the reason for that is because over the years, people had the difficult experience of books being damaged by water. So therefore, once bitten, twice shy. And what they decided to do, they would keep all libraries up on the upper store. The other thing that's curious about this is we're probably used to going into libraries and finding all the books against the wall, but in this case, the three-tier bookshelves are stacked, they're cabinets, and they're open on both sides. So that meant that the scholars who wanted to access the books, and by the way, books were so valuable that they were always chained to the shelf. They were never taken off the shelf and taken away. This was not a borrowing library. You could only go in and sit for the amount of time that you wanted to study, and then you would take the book away, maybe onto a separate table, but it still was joined by a chain. And if you notice that the books are open on both sides of the cabinet, and that is to allow access of light. And it was kind of curious because it was only with the development of this library onwards that people began to see the importance of natural daylight, because prior to that, buildings had very, very, very small windows. So we move on, and we see another interior here. It's the same building, it's just taken from a very, very slightly different angle. And you'll find that on the left-hand side, you might find the books don't seem to be real. And that's quite true, because these are little boxes which were inserted after the destruction of the library in 1550, when the Dean of Christ Church, who was anxious to remove any vestiges of the Catholic faith from the college, brought out many of the books. They were burned. Some of them were distributed to other friends. And unfortunately, we lost the majority of the books of Duke Humphrey's collection. So if I say there was over 280 books, well, at the moment, there are only 3 which remain from the original collection. And all the other books have been either burned, destroyed, or have disappeared and have been lost. But nevertheless, they were then replaced by the kindness of one of the great patrons, which I mentioned a moment ago, Sir Thomas Bodley, who was a great patron. He was a former member of the college, and because he'd been a diplomat and he had money, he decided to donate money towards restoring the library. Now, here we are actually underneath the library. So if we had come into the library, we'd look through the door and we'd come into this extraordinary hall. And it's a magnificent hall. It's called the Divinity School, and it was constructed between 1427 and 83 or 84. It's apparently the oldest surviving part of the university, which was built in the Gothic Perpendicular. And the Gothic Perpendicular is a particular style, as you can see, with large windows, similar to what we may have seen in France at Notre Dame and Chartres. The masons at this stage were absolute master masons. They knew exactly what they were doing. And they made these beautiful vaults. And these are hanging vaults which almost drop into the room. And by the way, just as a matter of curiosity, those of us who are interested in St. John Henry Newman, who was a student here and who launched the Oxford movement in the mid-19th century, an effort to fuse Anglicanism and Catholicism together, although ultimately a failed enterprise, and which resulted in his leaving the church and being received into the Catholic Church. Nevertheless, this was where he had studied, and he stood in one or other of these pulpits on the right or left-hand side to make his defense of his thesis when he was a student at the college. So this is one of the places that John Henry was certainly. Another room built in the 1630s was the convocation room, the convocation hall, and that was where the university professors would meet to discuss courses which were being placed, proposals of elections, etc., and maybe some student problems. So this is one of the beautiful buildings, one of the, again, imposing and yet simple at the same time, marvelous building. And this was used by King Charles I in the 1640s when he took refuge in Oxford. He'd been expelled from London, and he held his parliament here in this building. Again, just to remind us of the extraordinary care that went into the preparation of a manuscript. You'll be able to see the lines which have been incised on the manuscript, almost invisible to the human eye. The quill, which is writing with gall oak, which was taken from acorns and mixed with water. And then on our right-hand side, we have a beautiful Anglo-Saxon enamel reading help. And this was a small little, it was probably about maybe the size of your thumb. It was a reading aid because, again, when you were reading, your eyes could get tired, and you ran this across the bottom of the page, so you could, under the line, each line you were reading, and this would keep you on the correct line. The Radcliffe camera, or the Radcliffe room, is part of the Oxford Library. Again, it dates from the 18th century, and it's a donation made by Radcliffe, who was one of the former students of the college and who wanted to aid the collection and the preparation of the student's life. So this is the wonderful round building, which is at the heart, the center of Oxford. So on the left-hand side, we've an interior view, and on the outside we have an exterior view. And when you go to Oxford, this is one of the buildings that you've got to see, although sadly it's not possible to enter unless you are a student. Now, I mentioned Oxford was very important during the period of the Reformation, and William Tyndale, in the 15th century, argued that the Bible, which was available only to Catholics to be read in Latin, the Vulgate language, the language which people ordinarily spoke, needed to be translated into the vernacular, needed to be translated into the language that the everyday person could understand. And he argued that the book should be understood by just everybody, not just by monks, not just by clerics, not just by educated people. And finally, in the 17th century, King James I gave his agreement to this argument that the book should be translated. And that's why we have what we call the King James Bible, which is visible with this title page on our right-hand side, which was published in the early 17th century and transformed people's understanding of the Bible. Now, today, we're used to having a Bible and open it up in our own language. But just think, until the 15th century, the church would not permit people commonly to read the Bible in anything but Latin. And because people didn't read Latin, that meant that they didn't read. Oxford is a place which combines traditions and modern discoveries as well. And here we have just one of the moments in the school year when the Chancellor attends the Sheldonian Theatre for a convocation. And these convocations and other ceremonies can be for a variety of reasons, but the most important one, and the one that most people enjoy, is to come to attend for the graduation of their sons or daughters. Now, one of the most beautiful places as we move over to Cambridge, leaving Oxford behind us, an hour and a half or two on the train, we've moved now northeast into Cambridge. And as I mentioned, in the 1200s, students moved over from Oxford, I should say, to Cambridge. And after the 1160s, King Henry II decided that he didn't want English students studying in France, in Paris, so he ordered that all would come home and study in Oxford. So the only two universities which were now available were Oxford or Cambridge. And this is one of the most iconic buildings that I've ever seen in my life. And I'm fortunate enough to live within a couple of hours flight from Dublin. So I usually go over a couple of times a year to Cambridge or Oxford. And this is a side view of a marvelous building, which we're going to examine a little bit more in depth. It was started by the 25-year-old Henry IV, who decided that he wanted to build Henry VI, who decided he wanted to build a chapel which would be for the glory of God. And yet, believe it or not, this building was only for 12 scholars. He wanted 12 children from Eton School to attend university here, and this is what he built. So it's a magnificent structure which was commenced in 1446, and yet did not finish until 1515, several monarchs later. So Henry VI had planned to build this probably within 5 or 10 years, but unfortunately the War of the Roses, which we don't have time to get into, got in between, and therefore the college chapel lay empty for many, many years because the coffers of the monarchy ran out and they were not able to continue this. But the fan vault, as we look up, is the work of John Wastel. It's regarded as the largest in the world, and it was completed as the college came to an end just prior to its dedication in 1515 under King Henry VIII. It's got 21 windows, 10 on each side, and these date also from the time of the finishing of the building. And these were all made not by English artists, but by Flemish artists. And you'll see that there's also a different type of stone which is used from time to time. There's Yorkshire stone and Nottingham stone used, and this is one of the most iconic views again. And as we look inside from the organ gallery, we're actually standing on the organ gallery. We can see the choir. Unfortunately, we cannot hear them at the moment. But as we look down to the choir, we see one of the premier choirs in the whole world, which is dedicated to English choral music, both in Latin and in English. And you see the vast stained glass windows, which were made by the Flemish artists in a period of just under 15 years. Again, if we look on the up into the gallery, we were standing on the gallery moment. Now we're looking back from the floor up into the gallery to the 17th century organ case. The original organ was built, and the oak carvings which we see were originally made in the 15th century under Henry VIII, but then they were added in, the organ was expanded over the years. And on our left hand side we have King Henry as a young man, and on the right hand side we have Queen Anne Boleyn, and she was the king's consort at the time when the chapel was dedicated in 1515. And these are just an example of the marvelous carvings which were made by Peter the Carver. We don't know where it came from, but these oak carvings were made for the choir stalls, for the scholars and for the religious authorities to sit in and to pray the daily offices. Once more, we're looking down at the level of the stained glass, and the stained glass, as I mentioned, came from Flanders. The masters of stained glass, they brought the glass with them. They imported it from Flanders, but also there was foundries where a certain amount of the ordinary glass was made. There's a marvelous painting which is completely out of place, and yet again is very familiar to anybody who visits this wonderful chapel. It's the Nativity of Christ, painted by Peter Paul Rubens in 1634, and it was made for the Blue Nuns in Louvain in Belgium, but was donated in 1968 to King's College. And the college authorities, getting the gift of a Rubens, didn't know what to do with it. They had nowhere to put it because they don't have guests, they don't have a museum, they don't have people coming anywhere else apart from this public space of the chapel. And so the decision was made to put the large painting, the large canvas, in the area of the sanctuary. And for that reason, they had to actually excavate and go down. And if you see behind the candlesticks, there's a level there, which is probably about 3 feet. That shows how further down they had to go to lay down a new floor in order to accommodate the great altarpiece. Looking up at this bayed ceiling, this was made, the original decoration was by Reginald of Ely, and these large bays were actually, the whole ceiling was completed in a period of 3 years, which is absolutely extraordinary to consider that the roof was oak beams above, it was a wooden roof above, and then this was a stone carving which was inserted underneath. So again, when we look at this place, when you go into King's College, the acoustics, the choir, the sound, the smell is just something that you probably never experience again in your life. It's one of the most beautiful experiences. And the carvings are so delicate. We'll find the roses are a symbol of the House of Tudor, of the Henrys. Henry the Eighth was a Tudor, and he asked for this particular decoration to cover the whole of his chapel so that everybody would know that this was a Tudor, it was a royal foundation. Again, the great stained glass window, the end window, a magnificent window, depicts the crucifixion and the passion and the life of Christ, and this stands over the high altar. On our left hand side is the actual window itself, and on the right hand side is a 19th century drawing or depiction, a lithograph of the design itself. And very often I find when I look at stained glass windows, I can't really understand what it's all about because it's so high above me. And therefore nowadays we can use photography and we can get all these wonderful close-ups. And here we have obviously Christ flanked by the thieves, the good and the bad thief, on the day of his crucifixion. But in years gone by, you relied on books and drawings. There were no photographs. Remember, the photograph is a 19th century invention. So in the past, people depended on engravings and paintings. And I just came across this when I was shuffling through photographs. I found this little fellow on our right-hand side. He's a bat. And I don't think I need make any more comment about that. And again, just to show, this is a different style. This is called grisaille. Instead of having very strong polychrome colors, the artist has chosen to paint onto the warmed glass, and this is then fired. So these details are all painted by brush, and yet to think that this is on glass. It's an extraordinary work of art. And perhaps one of the things, I had some very nice comments from our meeting last week. And as I say, many people were saying, oh, I wish I had more time to visit, or I wish I could visit. And somebody wrote to me just last week saying that they were going to go back over these talks and look at a few on YouTube of these and learn more. And I think that would be a wonderful thing if we could even learn more and find out more about our passion. Another of the great libraries we could visit is at Trinity College, and this was designed by the great 17th century English architect Christopher Wren, who's probably best known for his Cathedral of St. Paul in London, which was constructed after the Great Fire of 1666. And once more you'll find in the library, as we're looking down the courtyard, the library is on the upper floor. So it's where the large windows are. And again, as we look into the library, we've got the bookcases are protruding out perpendicularly into the room. And again, one of the reasons for that was to take advantage of daylight, because they didn't want candles or they didn't want artificial lamps showing the light, because these were hazards for fire. So they wanted to use daylight. In the 1450s, the movable printing type press was invented, and that totally revolutionized illuminated manuscripts. In fact, it was the death knell for illuminated manuscripts. Already Caxton at the end of the 14th century, and then Gutenberg in the 15th century was going to make these printed books more popular. And this is just a view of a printing press. And it suddenly meant that now from forward, the books that we look at could look like illuminated manuscripts. They still kept the print, but now they could be printed not on vellum, not on animal skin, but on paper. Paper was cheaper, it was easy to cut, it was easy to store, easy to restore as well. And this is a Gutenberg Bible, if I'm not mistaken. It's one of the collection of the library. And this just shows just in the move over period from the illuminated manuscript, they still kept the gold blocking on the pages of the book. So still looked rich, and they still carried out a few hand decorations of the book in order that it would remind you of an illuminated history. And I just wanted to show you one of the scholars' alcoves where you would sit to read your book, but just look on the right-hand side and you've got the catalogue of all the books that are in that alcove. So you open the little door, you see it's a little wooden panel which is decorated with carvings, and you open in and you've got the catalogue there of all the books which were preserved on the shelves. Time has run away, and so must we, and we come to the last piece of Cambridge that I wanted to visit today with you. This is the Corpus clock. It was designed by the philanthropist John Taylor, who was a mathematician, he was an engineer, he was a scientist, etc. He did a lot of important investigative work about the boiling point of liquids, etc., and even made his fortune in kettles, one of the domestic appliances which boils water. And this is called the chronograph, or the time meter. The favorite name that Taylor had was the time meter. And instead of being a clock like we're used to with hands giving the hour, the minute, and even the seconds, what he's done is he's made a circle which is plated with 24 karat gold, and that's a little joke on his part. He's an extremely wealthy man, but he wanted to give this chronograph, which apparently cost over £1 million. He wanted to give this as a reminder of how much time is our enemy. And he always refers to time as our enemy because it always means that we never have enough time to do the things that we want to do. And the reason he quoted it with gold is he said, gold is our most precious material, and yet even gold cannot save us from time. As you open the clock, you would see that it's got little lights inside. And so the time moves, it only becomes accurate every 5 minutes, it adjusts itself to accuracy. But the three bands that you can see on the inside from the exterior to the interior measure the hours, the minutes, and the seconds in reverse order. And the grasshopper jumps to and fro on the clock and seems to give us the message that time is running out, and indeed as time has run out for our visit today. So again, I'd like to thank the Asian chapter of the Patrons of the Arts of the Vatican Museums for inviting me to be with you this afternoon, and maybe to inspire us to visit two of these wonderful university towns, hidden gems of England. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Father Michael, for a most insightful and engaging session. I'm sure many of us wish we could be there visiting right now, as you have mentioned. But this comes as close a second as we can get. There are a number of questions coming in. If I could start with one, how did the invention of the printing press affect the livelihood of the scribes?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Well, it put them out of work, really, because as I say, you suddenly changed from producing skin manuscripts, which would be made from animals, so that immediately ruled out farmers, suppliers. That was one group that were knocked out. Those who supplied even the simple things like quills, inks, pigments, etc., they were also knocked out. The actual scribes themselves, those who did the physical work, which is a very hard, time-consuming work, and the illuminated manuscript, that was also knocked out. So therefore, I would say that there was a large number of people who were put out of work, but at the same time, people are very resilient, and maybe some of them retrained in the whole area of printing. Because I think if you're a lover of books, no matter what happens, you'll move. Like, for example, I love books, but I also love my computer and my technology, which allows me new ways of using things.
Right. And that actually leads into another question from Millet Arnedo. How were books and manuscripts preserved in those days post Henry V?
Well, again, I think it would be very important to say that the kings and the monarchs and the patrons indeed were very much behind learning. The person who controls knowledge controls power, as you know. So therefore, really, I guess that the royal patrons and the royal family wanted to use these places of learning, and that's why the universities were so extraordinarily important. And I'll give you just one very simple example to highlight that. When Henry VIII was looking for his annulment of the marriage of Catherine with Catherine of Aragon, he appealed to the scholars at Oxford University to help him write his letter to Pope Clement VII in order to petition for the annulment. So he was looking to the powerhouse, if you like. So I would say that books are preserved, but as you know, just to repeat, the person who has control of knowledge has the power.
Thank you, Father. I'm actually going to jump to another question before the others that follows from that, from Roger Chua. Do you think all of the exquisite collections of art in various locations would be digitalized to reach a wider audience worldwide?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I'm delighted to say that absolutely, not only is Oxford making its move, Cambridge making its move, all the individual collections, like for example, Cambridge has a wonderful museum called the Fitzwilliam. Oxford has a wonderful museum called the Ashmolean. They're museums, they're not simply libraries, and all of these are digitalizing everything that they've got and putting them online. And this is the move forward for universities all over the world. They're getting their collections from the shelves it's now becoming really easy and economic to digitalize images. I remember 20, 30 years ago, I was involved in a project digitalizing a book, an Irish manuscript, and it was so painstaking. It took about a year. Today, if we were to do the same job, it would take 2 days. So I'm glad to say that all the universities, including, I'm glad also to add, the Vatican archives are being digitalized. Not everything, because there's a lot of stuff that people wouldn't be interested in. But keep in mind, Oxford alone has 13 million books in the deposit library, because Bodley made an agreement with the stationer's office in, I think it was 1612, if I'm not mistaken, that every book that's printed is deposited at Oxford. So every single book in the world is kept. There isn't a place in Oxford, so now they're kept in storage spaces around in towns outside Oxford. But at the moment, they're close on 13 million books, I believe, and every single book is preserved. So they're not going to digitalize every book. That would be impossible. And many of the books are now coming out on ebook on your computer rather than buying the hardback book, and a lot of people are using Kindle. So I salute you in Asia, because I know you're the leaders of technology.
Thank you, Father. Mina Chan wants to know, when did Oxford and Cambridge start to accept female students?
It was actually at the end of the 19th century they began to accept female students, and yet the first woman to receive an honorary doctorate was in 1948, the Queen Mother. So it was really only after the Second World War that women were accepted more openly into the college. And nowadays, of course, it's a 50-50. There are around, I was asking somebody just before we came on today, how many students are in each college, and the official numbers are now not available because everything's gone online. But up to the summer, the expectation was that there would be in excess of 21,000 students in Oxford and 23,000 students in Cambridge, and yet Cambridge is not opening lectures in person and is doing virtually all their teaching online this year. So at the moment it's 50-50, and one of the great things about the universities is that maybe 50, 60 years ago it was exclusively, these were the two great universities, they were exclusively, I would say, white and largely male. And over the last 3/4 of a century, everything has evened out, and people of all races, of all religions, of all cultures are now welcome. The fees are expensive, as we know, especially for overseas visitors and students. But nevertheless, if you want a really good education, Oxford and Cambridge are still up there.
Okay, and relating to accepting of all religions, okay, William Chang has a question. How many non-Anglican colleges are there in Oxbridge, and when did these universities start accepting Catholicism?
Well, that's probably a complicated question, and I could only probably answer very simply. In Oxford, for example, you have St. Benet's Hall, which is an old foundation, but keep in mind that the majority of the colleges really are Anglican. They all became Anglican Episcopalian reformed in the middle of the 16th century. So Catholicism is very, 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 very small. And as I mentioned earlier, John Henry Newman, who is a Don, he was also the vicar of St. Mary the Virgin on High Street in Oxford. He tried to unite the two churches, or bring Catholic elements back into the Anglican tradition to enrich it. And ultimately it didn't work out and he left. But fortunately, ecumenism has moved enormously since the time of Newman, and unity between the churches is, I think it's still within the horizon. It's far away, but it's still on the horizon. So I would have to be very honest and say that question would be, it's a brilliant question, but it's possibly a little bit too long and complex to go into here beyond what I've said.
Thank you, Father. Bruce Hemmingson wants to know, with regards to stonemasonry, over such a long build time, how did they ensure the conformity in the stonemasonry?
That's a very interesting question. And curiously, I think King's College, which, as you've seen, the dates are 1446 to 1515. it's very true that how did they manage to keep it? First of all, the problem of trying to access and source stone was difficult. So they moved from Yorkshire to Nottinghamshire, and there's two different sets of stone. But fortunately, this particular style, it's called the High Gothic English Perpendicular, and it was a style which had been laid down. The drawings were preserved from the original architect Reginald of Ely, and these were passed down from one generation to the other. So that's really the reason they were able to stay pretty much within the style. But it's a very good question, and actually makes me think, because it's almost miraculous that the whole thing stands with such conformity and such unity.
Thank you, Father. Another question from Bruce. During World War I, was the Cambridge Library converted to be a hospital? Why such a location?
Well, yes, in fact, many of the colleges were used simply because many of the students had studied there. I remember, actually, not going off the point, but I remember a couple of years ago in 2018, going to Cambridge for the day of armistice on the 11th day, the 11th hour of 1918, when the war came to an end. And the name of 218 of the, more than 218 or 20 of the former students and scholars and even academics who had gone to war were called out. And it was the first time the Dean told me that their names had been called out in a memorial service in one century. So it was a place where all the colleges had space. The colleges were empty. Nobody was going to university virtually during the war, very few. And therefore it was a place where they had lots of large buildings which could be attended to by nurses and doctors, all within the one area with appropriate buildings.
Thank you, Father. In your last lecture, you had told us about the gargoyles at Notre Dame being functional. Janet Wong has a question. There are many pinnacle spires in the Gothic architecture in Cambridge. Are these purely ornamental, or are they also functional, like the gargoyles at Notre Dame?
Well, again, yes, they're functional, because think of it, all these people, all the architects and masons and builders, etc., they like to design, they like to have a little flourish and embellishment on their buildings. But the bottom line was all of these things began with a practical reason. And the guttering is essential, because unless you take the water off the top part of a building, it'll become waterlogged, you'd have placement, etc. But if I could just make one point, which I had forgotten to mention, which is interesting. During the Second World War, the majority of the windows, the stained glass windows, were removed from King's College in order to prevent their destruction had Cambridge been bombed by the Germans. So England is dotted with magnificent cathedrals and buildings. A very close by building is Ely Cathedral. And if all the stained glass was to be taken out of all the buildings during the war, it would have been impossible. But because Cambridge was iconic and so important, that's why they went ahead and removed the large part of the stained glass windows during the 1940s.
Thank you, Father. Joan Fu Mahoney has a question. American Ivy League colleges have modeled their architecture on Oxbridge ideal of colleges around a quadrangle, etc. They also tried hard, they had the funds to emulate and even outdo the scoring Gothic spires of Oxford and Cambridge. Did they succeed?
Yes, yes, I think so. I think so. I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a couple of 4 years ago when Pope Francis was there, and I was mesmerized by it. I think the American colleges are magnificent. But I will say one thing: I adore American architecture, both modern and older, and I'm fascinated by American furniture, because very often they model on old European prototypes, but because they're brand new, they make perfect reproductions. They're usually much larger and even more imposing than the originals. And when I come back to Europe, I just look at what we have, the originals, and they're also small and very often shabby. So I have to say I'm an American file.
Thank you, Father. We have time for one more question, and it is the last question. Daniel Tendine, back in those days, these libraries had patrons who were royals and scholars. How about the commoners?
Well, I would say very rarely did the commoner actually make it up, because education was elitist until the 20th century. And as I mentioned today, the universities of Cambridge and Oxford would take in no more than 45,000 between them, students, undergraduates and graduates. But then there are a lot of other universities across the face of England. And just keep in mind that most of these didn't open until the early 20th century, because Cambridge and Oxford had the monopoly, if you like, on chartered education. So yeah, it's quite difficult to know what we've got at the moment, but I would say that it's marvelous to see that somebody from relatively, how shall I say, unmoneyed backgrounds can make honest money. And at the same time, there are many people within the history of Cambridge and of Oxford who made money on the back of extortion, of the slave trade, etc., etc., etc. So I would say that unfortunately, when people make money, very often they may not always make it from the right means, but in the past, certainly the great period of patronage was often people wanted to make an allowance or make reparation for something that they'd done of which they were slightly ashamed, and that's why they endowed colleges, churches, etc. with their wealth. And I think that's really the story of many of the patrons today. And I know some people who've started off with very limited means and have become very wealthy, and again, many of them have become very generous in sharing what they have, because after all, you know, most of us grow no higher than 7 feet. We're all pretty similar. We all have similar features, and that's what we are. So your money doesn't define you. What you do with your money defines you.
Thank you, Father. And that's all the time we have for questions and answers. And we thank you very much again, once again, Father. And up next, we have Charlotte Young, Director of the Asian Patrons of the Arts in the Vatican Museums, to tell us more about the organization.
Before I begin, I want to thank all of you for spending your Saturday attending this lecture series with our engaging speaker, Father Collins, who has certainly opened our eyes and minds to the history and beauty of the great libraries of England. As for myself, I first joined the patrons in 2017 because I wanted to go with the patrons to the Vatican and be up and close to the artistic treasures there, especially the Sistine Chapel. It was a very memorable experience for me and my husband, which was why I started volunteering with the patrons and was later invited to be on the board of directors. The key contribution of the patrons of the arts in the Vatican museums is the restoration and conservation of priceless works of art, monuments, and buildings in the museums of the Vatican. The Vatican has 7 specialized restoration laboratories, each manned by a team of expert restorers. The 7 laboratories are tapestries and textiles, painting and wood materials, ethnological materials. Can we have the previous slide, please? A little explanation here about ethnological materials. Non-European art is classified under ethnological art in the Vatican, and these pieces are created from materials not found in European art, which is why there's a special lab for their restoration. The other labs are stone materials, metals and ceramics, mosaic, and paper. Scientific research and technology, in combination with the restorer's artistry, transform aged and decaying art pieces back to its original beauty. This video, which we will show you now, is an insight into the prodigious work that goes into the Vatican's art restoration. I hope you enjoyed the video. The attention to detail that the restorers give to their work is amazing. I will now share with you some photos of my visits to some of the restoration labs. In this photo, uh, these photos were taken in the Painting and Wood Restoration Lab. These pieces were restored in 2018 when I visited and show the different types of art restored in this lab. There's an oil painting on the left. In the center is a wooden polyptych painted with the Madonna and Child and Saints. And on the left is a crucifix made of wood with me listening attentively to our guide. Here are some pictures we took of our visit to the Tapestry and Textile Lab, where skilled craftsmen restore centuries-old tapestries and fabric. The fabric and threads are of silk, wool, and linen. Being organic, they break down over time, and the team in this lab will meticulously clean, repair, and restore the fabric so that they can be displayed in their original glory for visitors to admire and enjoy. Next slide. The Stone Materials Lab restores stone and plaster works, which are movable like sculpture, as well as monuments and objects at archaeological sites. You saw in the video the restoration of stone monuments in the Vatican Gardens. The photo of the Stone Materials Lab here show elaborately carved marble sarcophagi and sculpture dating from Roman times. This slide here shows the ethnological materials laboratory. As I mentioned earlier, the Ethnological Museum Anima Mundi displays non-European works of art from all over the world, which were gifted to the popes. Anima Mundi means soul of the world. This laboratory is adjacent to this museum and restores these art pieces. Here you see the restoration of a red lacquer tabletop and screen, which belonged to the Empress Sisi from the Qing dynasty. These photos were taken in 2017. Note the intricate carvings on the lacquer. As I said at the start of my talk, the key contribution of the patrons is the restoration of art in the Vatican. And our Asian chapter has contributed to the following projects. From the top left clockwise, the Scala Sancta or Holy Stairs, the entrance to the carriage pavilion, a 13-piece set in red lacquer from Empress Sisi's parlor. You saw a photo of the round tabletop and screen being restored in the previous slide. 3 Taoist paintings from the Ming dynasty and a gold-plated wood statue of Amida Nyorai, and the painting of the Great Wall of China on silk. Next. The silk scroll with a painting of the Great Wall and 2 vases from the red lacquer set were displayed at a special exhibition in the Forbidden City last year. APAVM is very happy to have played a small role in the soft diplomacy between the Holy See and Beijing. Now let us take a closer look at the art pieces that APAVM has sponsored. The painting on silk of the Great Wall of China was APAVM's first project, and it was sponsored in 2016. This silk scroll is mounted on paper and is 775 centimeters long and 37 centimeters wide. It is dated to the end of the 17th century and shows a detailed map of the area around the Great Wall, detailing cities, rivers, and encampments. The scroll had to be cleaned and disinfected, torn and worn out areas of silk were repaired, discolored old glue had to be removed, and the paper backing replaced. The restorers studied and used Oriental techniques when restoring this priceless piece. It is now housed in a climate-controlled case in the Ethnological Museum. Here are pictures of the elaborately carved 13-piece red lacquer set from the parlor of the last Empress of China, Sisi. The restoration of these antiques from the Qianlong period of the Qing dynasty was sponsored by APAVM in 2017. This set is made of wood and covered in red lacquer, black lacquer, pigments, and gold. This exquisite statue of Amida Nyorai is from the Heian period in Japan and is gold-plated and is of gold-plated and lacquered wood, glass, and majolica. The 3 Taoist paintings are from the Ming Dynasty. These pieces were sponsored in 2018. As you can see, the Vatican's collection is truly eclectic and includes art from other religious traditions which were given to the Pope. The Scala Sancta, or Holy Stairs, were the stairs that Jesus climbed to meet Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, who tried him and sentenced him to death by crucifixion. The stairs were brought back from Jerusalem to Rome by Saint Helena in the 4th century. The walls of the building which houses the Holy Stairs are covered with frescoes from the Renaissance. As you can see from the photo, these frescoes have dulled and darkened over the centuries. The original vibrant colors of these magnificent frescoes were unveiled in 2019 after years of painstaking restoration. You can see the scaffolding used for the restoration in the photo, which was taken when the patrons visited in 2016, in the midst of the restoration. APAVM is proud to have been part of the restoration of the Holy Stairs, and we are acknowledged in the marble plaque on the right. You will learn more about the restoration of the Holy Stairs next week from patron and former APAVM Director Lim Soon Hock. The carriage pavilion displays the modes of transport of the popes through the ages. There are horse-drawn carriages and modern cars, including the one that St. John Paul was in when he was shot. That is the white car on the bottom left. This carriage pavilion is strategically located in an area where tour groups to the Vatican meet. However, because this museum is located in the basement, the entrance is not prominent and many visitors do not see it and enter, missing out on a fascinating historical display. Therefore, the Vatican proposed a new entrance with a lift for the carriage pavilion, and APAVM agreed to sponsor this project, which will be completed in 2021. During each APAVM trip, an alfresco lunch is organized for us outside this inconspicuous entrance to the carriage pavilion. You can see us here relaxing and having an enjoyable time. The latest project which APAVM is undertaking is the restoration of the historic Bramante courtyard. In my 2017 visit, what I saw was the building in the top center photo. It was old, dark, and dingy looking. Scaffolding was erected around many of the other buildings in the courtyard as restoration was underway. In 2018, I was amazed at what had been accomplished by the restoration work. The same dark building in the center transformed into the one on the top right. The difference is like night and day. This is the 2018 group standing in front of the restored portion of the courtyard with the famous pine cone sculpture. APAVM Chairman Ben Chang will speak more about the Bramante courtyard in talk 4 of this lecture series. As patrons, we enjoy many privileges like exclusive visits to museums like the Sistine Chapel. We always end our visit with a tour in the evening when it is closed to the public. We are taken to the different museums on the way to the empty Sistine Chapel, and we actually have the Sistine Chapel all to ourselves. After our tour, there will be a special dinner just outside the chapel, graced by Cardinal Batello, the President of the Vatican State. To conclude, I wish to state that the contribution of the patrons makes an impact on the Vatican's art collection, which is for the enjoyment and evangelization of all, a mission of the Vatican Museum. Thank you.
And thank you, Charlotte. I hope all of you have enjoyed today's lecture. Next week, at the same time in the chivalrous cities of Spain's Golden Triangle, once again, Father Michael will take us to the Spanish cities of Seville, Cordoba, and Granada. These cities abound in spectacular examples of Islamic and Christian art, and reflect a time where Jews, Muslims, and Christians once lived in harmony. Do join us then. Our thanks once again goes to Father Michael Collins for the lecture, to the Asian patrons of the arts in the Vatican Museums for the presentation of this series, and to all our patrons and guests for joining us today. Until we see you in Spain next week, adios, stay safe and stay well.